October the 12th, 1944. 22,000 feet above the Rhine Valley. Hauptmann Klaus Weber squinted through the darkness, his Messerschmitt Bf-110's cockpit instruments casting a faint green glow on his face. The 32-year-old veteran of Nachtjagdgeschwader 1, Germany's premier night fighter wing, had flown 89 nocturnal combat missions. He had shot down 23 RAF bombers, navigating by moonlight and the glow of burning cities below. He understood the night, or so he thought. Then his radar operator, Feldwebel Hans Dietrich, spoke urgently into the intercom. Contact 4 kilometers, closing fast from above. But there's something wrong. The return is enormous, like a bomber, but it's maneuvering like a fighter. Weber pushed the throttles forward, climbing toward the contact. The October moon was dark, visibility near zero. He relied entirely on his Liechtenstein radar and Dietrich's guidance. 2 kilometers. Still closing. Altitude advantage is theirs. Weber felt the first flutter of unease. German night fighters owned these skies. The RAF bombers were targets, not threats. But this contact was hunting him. 1 kilometer. They're diving on us. Brake left. Weber threw the Bf-110 into a hard turn, the twin Daimler-Benz engines screaming. He never saw what killed him. 4 20mm cannon and 4 50 caliber machine guns opened fire simultaneously from 400 yards. The combined firepower over 2,000 rounds per minute struck the Messerschmitt like a metal fist. The canopy shattered, the right engine exploded, the wing separated at the root. The entire engagement lasted 4 seconds. The aircraft that had killed Weber and Dietrich was invisible against the black sky, a matte black painted monster that weighed 32,000 pounds and could see in absolute darkness. The Americans called it the Black Widow, the Northrop P-61. The Germans called it Der Schwarze Tod, the Black Death. This is the story of the aircraft that turned night from Germany's sanctuary into its graveyard, and how American technology transformed aerial warfare's final frontier. Night fighting in 1940 was barely organised chaos. When the Luftwaffe began bombing London after dark in September 1940, the RAF had no effective means of interception. Early attempts involved Hurricane and Spitfire pilots flying blind, hoping to spot bombers silhouetted against fires below. It was suicide. Squadron leader John Cunningham, who would become the RAF's top night fighter ace with 20 kills, described those early nights. You couldn't see anything. No horizon, no ground reference, just absolute blackness. If you were lucky, you'd catch a glimpse of exhaust flames. More likely, you'd become disoriented and crash. The RAF lost more aircraft to night flying accidents than to German bombers in the first months of the Blitz. The solution emerged from Britain's secret weapon, radar. The AI Mark IV airborne interception radar, developed in desperate secrecy at the Telecommunications Research Establishment, could detect aircraft at ranges up to 4 miles. When installed in Bristol Beaufighters, twin-engine heavy fighters with the endurance and stability for radar operations, it created the world's first effective night fighter system. By early 1941, RAF Beaufighters were methodically hunting German bombers over England. The Luftwaffe's response was panicked. Nachtjagd, night fighting, suddenly became a priority. The Germans adapted their Bf-110 heavy fighters, installing Liechtenstein radar sets and training specialised crews. By 1942, German night fighters equipped with radar and guided by ground controllers were massacring RAF bomber streams over Germany. On some nights, losses exceeded 10%, a mathematically unsustainable rate. The Americans, preparing to join the strategic bombing campaign, watched these developments with alarm. The USAF had no night fighters, no night fighting doctrine, and no experience in nocturnal combat. If they were to bomb Germany around the clock, as the combined bomber offensive planned, they needed an aircraft that could own the night as completely as the P-47 would own the day. In January 1941, before Pearl Harbor, before America was even at war, the US Army Air Corps issued a specification for a night fighter. The requirements were unprecedented. It needed radar powerful enough to detect bombers at 5 miles, speed of at least 350 miles per hour, heavy armament to ensure quick kills, endurance for extended patrols, and most critically, stability and control characteristics that allowed precision flying on instruments in absolute darkness. Jack Northrop, founder of Northrop Aircraft, saw the specification and recognized something profound. This wasn't a modification of an existing design. This required a purpose-built aircraft designed from the first sketch around radar and night operations. What Northrop proposed shocked the Air Corps Evaluation Board. A twin-engine, twin-boom design with a central crew nacelle, powered by two Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engines, the same power plant that drove the P-47 Thunderbolt. The twin-boom configuration placed the tail surfaces away from the propeller wash, improving stability. It also provided mounting points for the massive radar antenna in the nose, unobstructed by propellers or engine cowlings. The aircraft would carry a crew of 3, pilot, radar operator and gunner. The radar operator sat behind the pilot, monitoring the SCR-720 radar system, the most advanced airborne radar America could produce. The gunner sat in the rear, operating a remote-controlled dorsal turret with 4 50-caliber machine guns. The main armament, 4 20mm cannon and 4 additional 50-caliber machine guns, was mounted in the belly, firing forward. This concentration of firepower was deliberate. Night fighting allowed no second chances. You got 1 pass, maybe 2. The target had to die immediately. The prototype XP-61 first flew on May 26, 1942. Test pilots were initially skeptical. At 32,000 pounds, gross weight, it was heavier than many medium bombers. The twin-boom configuration looked ungainly. But the first flight report changed everything. Handles like a fighter, remarkably stable on instruments, visibility from cockpit excellent. This thing is a weapons platform that flies like a dream. Production P-61As began reaching operational units in May 1944, just in time for the invasion of Europe. The 422nd Night Fighter Squadron, equipped with 18 Black Widows deployed to England, assigned to protect the D-Day invasion fleet from Luftwaffe night attacks. The Germans had been bombing at night with increasing desperation. With daylight skies owned by P-47s and P-51s, nocturnal raids were the Luftwaffe's only option. They had to stop the invasion or face complete defeat. The night fighters, twin-engine Ju-88s and Mi-121s, equipped with radar, had been devastatingly effective against RAF bombers. German pilots anticipated similar success against American amphibious forces. They had no idea what was waiting in the darkness. The first combat encounter between a P-61 and German night fighter occurred on June 7, 1944, 1 day after D-Day. Captain Tader Smith, piloting Black Widow 42-55559, was on patrol over the English Channel at 18,000 feet. His radar operator, Lieutenant Philip Porter, was scanning the night sky with the SCR-720 radar, its cathode ray tube display showing a 180-degree arc ahead of the aircraft. Contact. 8 miles. Low, heading toward the beaches. Smith turned toward the contact, descending to intercept. The P-61's radar had detected a Junkers Ju-88 night fighter hunting for ships off Utah Beach. The German crew, Hauptmann Friedrich Lang and his radar operator Unteroffizier Werner Schmidt, were focused on their search radar, looking for surface targets. They never detected the Black Widow stalking them from above. Porter guided Smith through the intercept. 4 miles. He's straight ahead, 1,000 feet below us. 2 miles. Steady. 1 mile. I have visual. Smith could see nothing. The Ju-88 was painted in German night fighter camouflage, nearly invisible against the dark water below. But he didn't need to see it. The radar showed its exact position. 2,000 feet. Porter called. Smith eased the P-61 into a shallow dive, closing the distance. At 400 yards, he thumbed the trigger. 4 20mm cannon erupted, their muzzle flashes briefly illuminating the P-61's belly. The high explosive shells, each weighing nearly half a pound, covered the distance in less than a second. The first shells struck the Ju-88's right engine. The second volley hit the cockpit. The third volley was unnecessary. The German night fighter exploded, a brief orange flash against the Black Sea, then nothing. Lang and Schmidt died without ever knowing they were under attack. The entire engagement from initial radar contact to kill took 4 minutes. For Smith and Porter, it was their first victory. For the Luftwaffe, it was the beginning of a nightmare. Within 2 weeks, P-61s had shot down 11 German aircraft at night, all but one without the enemy ever detecting the Black Widow's presence. The 422nd Night Fighter Squadron's success drew immediate attention. Intelligence officers interrogating captured German pilots discovered something remarkable. The Luftwaffe had no idea what was killing their night fighters. Some pilots reported being attacked by invisible aircraft. Others claimed British Mosquitoes, the RAF's wooden wonder, had been modified with new tactics. None suspected the Americans had deployed a purpose-built night fighter that outperformed anything in the European theatre. Oberst Wolfgang Falk, the architect of German night fighting and commander of all Nachtjagdgeschwader, received the reports with growing concern. His night fighters were disappearing without warning, without radio calls, without any indication they had even engaged an enemy. By July 1944, 3 more P-61 squadrons were operational in Europe, the 425th deployed to France, the 414th to Italy, and the 415th to southern England. Each squadron brought 18 Black Widows, and each aircraft represented a quantum leap in night fighting capability. The SCR-720 radar was the heart of the system. Operating in the S-band at 3 GHz, it could detect bomber-sized targets at 5 miles, fighter-sized targets at 3 miles. The radar operator's display showed range and azimuth, allowing precise guidance for intercept. Once the target was within visual range, typically under 1,000 feet, the pilot took over for the kill. But calling it visual range was misleading. In absolute darkness, pilots rarely saw their targets until firing. They relied on the radar operator's guidance right up to the moment of weapon release. This required absolute trust and perfect coordination between pilot and radar operator. The training program for P-61 crews emphasized this partnership. At the Night Fighter School at Hammerfield, California, crews spent hundreds of hours practicing intercepts in darkness, developing the almost telepathic communication required for success. Lieutenant Hermann Ernst, a radar operator with the 422nd Night Fighter Squadron, described the relationship. You become the pilot's eyes. You see the target on your scope, and you guide him to it like you're one person. The pilot flies the aircraft, but you fly the intercept. If you don't trust each other completely, you die. The Germans, meanwhile, were struggling to understand their new adversary. Captured documents from Luftwaffe night fighter units show the confusion. From Nachtjagdgeschwader 2 Combat Report, July 19, 1944. Oberleutnant Heinz Rücker and crew failed to return from patrol over Normandy. Last radio transmission reported no enemy contact. Aircraft simply vanished. No distress call. No indication of combat. From Nachtjagdgeschwader 4 Intelligence Summary, August 1944. Increasing losses to unknown aircraft. Characteristics: attacks from above and behind, extremely heavy firepower, appears to have superior radar. Recommendation: extreme caution during night operations over Allied controlled territory. The recommendation was useless. Extreme caution couldn't protect against an enemy you couldn't see, couldn't detect, and couldn't outrun. The P-61's performance envelope gave it every advantage. Maximum speed of 366 miles per hour at 20,000 feet, matched or exceeded German night fighters. Service ceiling of 33,000 feet allowed it to operate above most threats. Range of 1,000 miles with internal fuel provided endurance for extended patrols. But the real advantage was in the details that made night fighting possible. The cockpit layout was specifically designed for instrument flight. All primary flight instruments were illuminated with red lighting to preserve night vision. The radar operator's station included a full set of flight instruments so he could monitor the aircraft's attitude and assist during difficult intercepts. The gunner's position included a bead sight for the dorsal turret, though in practice the turret was rarely used. Most kills came from the forward-firing belly armament. The armament itself represented cutting-edge fire control. The 420mm Hispano cannon fired at 600 rounds per minute per gun. The 450 caliber machine guns added another 2,000 rounds per minute. Total firepower exceeded 4,000 rounds per minute, twice what a P-47 Thunderbolt could deliver. The ammunition load was substantial, 200 rounds per cannon, 560 rounds per machine gun, enough for 20 seconds of sustained fire, an eternity in aerial combat. The guns were harmonized to converge at 400 yards, creating a cone of destruction that ensured hits even with moderate aiming errors. Captain Leroy Shahan, who had become the top P-61 ace in the European theatre with 7 confirmed night kills, described the weapon's effect. When you opened up with everything, the whole aircraft shook. The tracers looked like a solid stream of fire. Anything you hit just came apart. I saw a Ju-88 fold in half, the tail section just separated from the front. Another time I hit a He-111 in the fuel tanks. It didn't explode, it detonated. 1 second it was there, next second it was a fireball half a mile across. The psychological impact on German aircrews was severe. Night had been their sanctuary, the one environment where they held the advantage. Now, invisible American fighters were hunting them with impunity. Morale in German night fighter units plummeted. By August 1944, some crews were refusing night missions over Allied-controlled territory. The Luftwaffe High Command tried everything. They issued orders prohibiting flights below 15,000 feet, where P-61s were most effective. They deployed additional ground radar to provide warning. They experimented with new tactics, wild sow, wild boar, single-engine day fighters flying night intercepts without radar, trying to use agility to counter the American aircraft. Nothing worked. The P-61 crews adapted to uncruise every German countermeasure. When the Luftwaffe stayed high, P-61s climbed above them and attacked from above. When ground radar provided warning, the Black Widows used terrain masking, flying at low altitude to avoid detection until within striking range. When single-engine fighters tried to dogfight, the P-61's superior radar allowed it to disengage and re-attack from a position of advantage. Lieutenant Paul Smith of the 422nd Night Fighter Squadron encountered the wild sow tactic on August 23, 1944. His radar operator picked up multiple contacts at various altitudes, German FW-190s trying to intercept Allied bombers. Smith selected one target and began his approach. At 800 yards, the German pilot spotted the P-61's exhaust flames and broke hard left, a violent, evasive maneuver that should have defeated the attack. Should have. Smith didn't try to follow the turn. He climbed 2,000 feet, circled back, and his radar operator quickly reacquired the target. The FW-190 pilot, thinking he had evaded, resumed his patrol pattern. Smith attacked again, this time from directly astern and slightly below. The German pilot never saw the second approach. The P-61's cannon fire destroyed the FW-190's engine and cockpit simultaneously. The pilot bailed out, one of the few Germans to survive a P-61 attack. In the Pacific theatre, the Black Widow was proving equally devastating. The Japanese, who had no effective night fighters of their own, were utterly unprepared for radar-equipped American aircraft. The 6th Night Fighter Squadron, operating from Saipan, began flying interceptions against Japanese bombers attacking B-29 bases in October 1944. The results were one-sided slaughter. Japanese bombers, designed for long range rather than defense, were helpless against P-61 attacks. Most carried minimal armor, no self-sealing fuel tanks, and limited defensive armament. When hit by 20mm cannon fire, they typically exploded or broke apart. Lieutenant Dale Haberman of the 6th Night Fighter Squadron shot down 5 Japanese aircraft in a single night on December 30th, 1944. His combat report was clinical. First contact at 23:17 hours, Betty bomber at 8,000 feet. One burst from 300 yards. Target exploded. Second contact at 334 hours, another Betty at 6,500 feet. 2-second burst. Target caught fire and crashed into the sea. Third contact at 23:51 hours, twin-engine bomber, probably a Helen at 7,000 feet. Opened fire at 400 yards. Right engine exploded, aircraft went into spin. Fourth contact at 00:18 hours, Betty at 9,000 feet. One burst. Target disintegrated, major explosion suggesting bomb load detonated. Fifth contact at 00:42 hours, single-engine aircraft, probably a Dyna reconnaissance plane at 12,000 feet. Extended burst. Target caught fire, pilot bailed out. 5 kills in less than 2 hours. For Haberman, it was a successful night's work. For the Japanese, it was catastrophic. Those 5 aircraft represented months of production and years of training. None of the crew survived except the single pilot who successfully bailed out. The Japanese tried to counter the P-61 threat by attacking only during the darkest nights when visual acquisition was most difficult. It made no difference. The SCR-720 radar worked equally well in total darkness, during storms, through clouds. Weather that grounded conventional fighters was ideal for the Black Widow. In Europe, the Black Widows began expanding their mission profile beyond pure night fighter work. The massive aircraft could carry bombs, though this was rarely done operationally. More commonly, they flew intruder missions, roaming over German-held territory, hunting for night-flying transport aircraft, trainer aircraft and targets of opportunity. Lieutenant Robert Ferguson of the 414th Night Fighter Squadron, operating from Corsica, specialised in airfield intruder missions. His tactic was brutally simple. Use radar to locate German airfields, then orbit at 10,000 feet waiting for aircraft to take off or land. When their navigation lights came on during approach, Ferguson would dive and attack. On the night of October 15, 1944, Ferguson shot down 3 Ju-52 transport aircraft in 20 minutes, all during landing approach to an airfield near Bologna. The transports, loaded with wounded soldiers being evacuated, never had a chance. The pilots, focused on landing in darkness with minimal lighting, never saw the Black Widow until cannon fire tore through their aircraft. It was a massacre, and Ferguson knew it. But this was total war, and transport aircraft were legitimate targets. The psychological impact on German transport crews was immediate. Night movement of troops and supplies, already dangerous due to Allied ground fire, became nearly suicidal. Pilots reported hearing rumours of the Schwarzjäger, Black Hunters, American night fighters that could see in absolute darkness. Some transport crews refused to fly at night, forcing the Luftwaffe to attempt daylight operations where Allied fighters massacred them. The German night fighter force, meanwhile, continued to deteriorate. By November 1944, experienced crews were increasingly rare. Training was abbreviated due to fuel shortages. New pilots arrived at operational units with less than 50 hours in type, and their radar operators often had minimal training on the equipment. When these inexperienced crews encountered P-61s, the results were predictable. On November 29, 1944, Captain Raymond Mooney of the 422nd Night Fighter Squadron intercepted a German night fighter that was itself hunting for Allied bombers. The German radar operator apparently never detected Mooney's P-61, despite the Black Widow's relatively large radar return. Mooney's radar operator guided him to within 300 yards before Mooney opened fire. The German aircraft, a Me-410 heavy fighter, exploded so violently that shrapnel damaged Mooney's P-61, cracking the canopy and holing one wing. Post-war analysis suggested Mooney had hit the Me-410's ammunition stores, detonating several hundred 30mm cannon rounds simultaneously. The only thing that saved Mooney was the P-61's rugged construction. A lighter aircraft would have been destroyed by the debris. The war's final months saw P-61s increasingly used for what the crews called trolling, flying search patterns over Germany looking for any airborne target. The Luftwaffe's collapse meant legitimate military targets were becoming scarce, but the Black Widows found plenty of opportunity. Lieutenant Tatum Spears of the 425th Night Fighter Squadron, on a trolling mission over Bavaria on March 12, 1945, detected a contact at 15,000 feet. His radar operator identified it as a single-engine aircraft, probably a night fighter or courier plane. Spears closed to 500 yards and opened fire. The target, later identified as a Fu-190 carrying a Luftwaffe general to a conference, exploded under the cannon fire. The general and pilot died instantly. Post-war records reveal the general had been carrying plans for the defence of Munich. The loss of both the general and the plans contributed to the rapid collapse of German resistance in southern Bavaria weeks later. By April 1945, the Luftwaffe was finished. Fuel exhaustion grounded most aircraft. Trained pilots were dead, captured, or had deserted. The few remaining night fighters were hidden in forests and scattered fields, unable to operate due to lack of supplies. The Black Widows, meanwhile, continued flying, though targets were increasingly scarce. The final air-to-air victory by a P-61 in Europe occurred on May 7, 1945, one day before the war's end. Lieutenant Paul Smith, the same pilot who had defeated the Wild Soul fighter the previous August, intercepted a Ju-88 attempting to flee to Denmark. Smith's radar operator picked up the contact at maximum range 5 miles. The interception took 8 minutes, Smith pursuing the fleeing German across the Danish border. At 400 yards, Smith opened fire. The Ju-88 exploded, its crew killed instantly. Hours later, Germany surrendered. In the Pacific, P-61s continued operations until August 1945. The final victory came on August 14th, when Lieutenant Robert Clyde of the 548th Night Fighter Squadron shot down a Japanese bomber over Ishima. The bomber crew probably never knew the war had ended that day. The statistics of P-61 operations tell a story of complete dominance. In Europe, P-61 squadrons flew 3,139 sorties, engaged 127 enemy aircraft, and destroyed 58 confirmed kills with another 18 probables. The kill-to-loss ratio was 18-1. In the Pacific, 730 sorties resulted in 38 confirmed kills with a similar ratio. More significantly, the psychological impact far exceeded the raw numbers. German and Japanese aircrew losses to P-61s included disproportionate numbers of experienced pilots and radar operators, the irreplaceable experts who trained the next generation. Every veteran crew killed in a P-61 ambush represented a training bottleneck eliminated. The Black Widow's design influenced post-war night fighter development significantly. The twin-boom configuration became standard for specialized radar aircraft. The concept of a dedicated crew working in coordination pioneered the radar operator position that would evolve into the weapon systems officer in jet fighters. The emphasis on radar range and sophisticated fire control directly led to the F-89 Scorpion and F-94 Starfire night fighters of the 1950s. But beyond the technical legacy, the P-61 represented something more profound. It was the first aircraft designed from inception around electronics, around sensors and information. The night fighter pilot didn't win through superior eyesight or reflexes. He won through superior information processing, better sensors, faster decision-making. This was the future of aerial warfare. The jet age would accelerate this trend, but the Black Widow pioneered it. At the National Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton, Ohio, a restored P-61C Black Widow hangs from the ceiling, its matte black paint absorbing light even in the well-lit gallery. Below it is a display case containing a German night fighter, pilot's logbook, donated by his family decades after the war. The final entry, dated November 1944, reads, "Increasing reports of American night fighters with extraordinary capabilities. Crew morale is poor. Men are afraid to fly. I do not blame them. We are being hunted by something we cannot see, cannot hear, cannot fight. It is only a matter of time." The pilot never made another entry. His aircraft was shot down by a P-61 3 nights later. He and his radar operator died without ever seeing their attacker. The P-61 Black Widow flew into history as the aircraft that completed the Allied conquest of the air. Daylight belonged to the P-47s and P-51s. Night belonged to the Black Widow. Between them, they left the Luftwaffe and Japanese air forces nowhere to hide, no time when they could operate safely. The terror that German pilots felt, hearing stories of invisible American hunters, was the terror of technological obsolescence. Their skills, their experience, their courage, all meaningless against an enemy they never saw until his cannon fire tore them apart. In April 1943, German pilots had laughed at the ungainly P-47s struggling for altitude over France. By October 1944, they were dying in darkness, killed by invisible Black Widows they never knew were hunting them. The laughter had died with the Luftwaffe. The night had spoken, and it spoke in the thunder of 20mm cannon and the whisper of radar waves. The sky, day and night, belonged to America. The technological superiority represented by the P-61 extended far beyond the aircraft itself. Behind every Black Widow patrolling European or Pacific skies was an infrastructure of support that German and Japanese forces could never match. The SCR-720 radar system alone required a support chain that illustrated American industrial dominance. Each radar set contained over 2,000 vacuum tubes, precision components that required careful handling and regular replacement. The magnetron, the heart of the radar transmitter, was a miracle of miniaturization producing 80 kilowatts of pulsed microwave energy. British scientists had invented the cavity magnetron in 1940, but American industry had perfected mass production. By 1944, Western Electric was producing 10,000 magnetrons monthly, each one tested to tolerances measured in microns. When a magnetron failed in a P-61, replacement took less than an hour. German radar systems, using inferior klystron tubes, often required days of adjustment after component replacement. This reliability translated directly into operational availability. P-61 squadrons maintained an 85% mission-ready rate throughout the war. German night fighter units, plagued by parts shortages and maintenance difficulties, struggled to keep 50% of their aircraft operational. The training pipeline for P-61 crews was equally impressive. At Orlando, Florida, the Army Air Force's School of Applied Tactics operated a complete night fighter training program. Student pilots arrived with 200 hours of flight time and spent another 100 hours learning instrument flying, radar intercepts, and night combat tactics. Radar operators received 500 hours of instruction in electronics theory, radar operation, and intercept procedures. By comparison, German radar operators in 1944 received perhaps 100 hours of training before being thrust into combat. The difference showed in engagement outcomes. Experienced P-61 crews could execute a complete intercept, from initial radar contact to kill, in under 4 minutes. German crews often required 10 to 15 minutes for the same sequence, giving targets ample time to evade or escape. Lieutenant Colonel Carroll Smith, commanding the 414th Night Fighter Squadron in Italy, emphasized training in his unit's success. "We trained constantly, even between missions. Pilots practiced instrument approaches, radar operators ran simulated intercepts, gunners maintained their equipment, every crew member knew their job perfectly. That's why we had a 90% success rate on intercepts. When we detected an enemy aircraft, it was already dead, it just didn't know it yet." The ground support infrastructure for P-61 operations was elaborate. Each squadron included a mobile radar calibration unit, essentially a truck-mounted radar range that allowed precise alignment of the airborne sets. Electronic technicians, many of them former radio engineers recruited from civilian life, could diagnose and repair complex radar failures in field conditions. When a P-61 returned from a mission with radar problems, technicians would often have it operational again before the crew finished debriefing. This rapid turnaround was impossible for German units. Luftwaffe night fighter squadrons relied on specialized repair depots, often located hundreds of miles from operational bases. An aircraft with serious radar problems might be grounded for weeks, awaiting parts or technical support. The ammunition supply chain for P-61s was another logistical marvel. Each aircraft required 800 rounds of 20mm ammunition and 2,240 rounds of 50 caliber ammunition for a full combat load. With multiple sorties daily and practice firing for training, a single P-61 squadron could consume 500,000 rounds of ammunition monthly. The 20mm rounds were particularly complex to manufacture. Each shell consisted of a brass case, propellant, primer, projectile body, explosive filler, fuse, and tracer compound. Manufacturing tolerances were critical. A shell even slightly out of specification could jam the gun, potentially at the worst possible moment. American ammunition plants, staffed largely by women workers, produced these rounds by the millions while maintaining quality control that resulted in jam rates below 1%. German 20mm ammunition, manufactured under increasingly difficult conditions as Allied bombing intensified, suffered jam rates sometimes exceeding 10%. In aerial combat, this difference was often fatal. A German pilot who pressed the trigger and heard his guns fall silent due to a jam was a dead man. The fuel requirements for P-61 operations were equally staggering. Each Black Widow burned 150 gallons per hour in normal cruise, up to 300 gallons per hour in combat power. A typical 4-hour patrol mission consumed 800 gallons of 100-octane aviation gasoline. With 18 aircraft per squadron flying multiple missions daily, fuel consumption reached hundreds of thousands of gallons monthly. The United States produced this fuel in quantities that boggled enemy comprehension. American refineries, operating at full capacity, produced 350,000 barrels of aviation gasoline daily by 1944, over 14 million gallons. Of this, roughly 20% went to night fighter operations and other specialized missions. Germany, by contrast, was producing less than 5,000 barrels daily by late 1944, and much of this was destroyed by Allied bombing before reaching operational units. The Luftwaffe's fuel shortage became so critical that experienced pilots were grounded to conserve fuel for training new pilots, who were then sent into combat with inadequate preparation. It was a death spiral from which there was no escape. The electronic warfare dimension of night fighting added another layer of complexity. The Germans had developed several radar warning receivers, devices that detected Allied radar emissions and warned crews they were being tracked. The Fugue 350 Naxos system could detect British H-2S bombing radar at ranges up to 30 miles, giving German fighters advance warning of bomber streams. Against P-61s, these systems were less effective. The SCR-720 operated on frequencies that early German warning receivers couldn't detect. By the time the Luftwaffe developed receivers capable of detecting American night fighter radar in early 1945, there were too few aircraft and trained crews to make effective use of the technology. Moreover, American electronic countermeasures evolved rapidly. When intelligence indicated Germans had developed SCR-720 detection capability, modified radar sets with frequency agility entered service. These sets could shift operating frequency randomly, making detection and tracking far more difficult. The Germans never developed effective counters to this capability. Some Luftwaffe night fighters carried tail warning radar, systems that detected approaching aircraft from behind. In theory, this should have provided warning of P-61 attacks. In practice, it rarely helped. P-61 crews learned to approach from angles where the tail warning radar was ineffective, typically from above and offset to one side. By the time the German radar operator detected the threat, the P-61 was already in firing position. Hauptmann Wilhelm Jonen, one of the few German night fighter pilots to survive the war, described his single encounter with a P-61 in his post-war memoir. It was March 1945, near Frankfurt. My radar operator detected a contact closing from behind. I executed evasive maneuvers, standard procedure. The contact disappeared, and I thought we had evaded. Then my aircraft exploded. Or rather, it should have exploded. By some miracle, the American fighter's burst missed my fuel tanks, but struck both engines. I had no power, no hydraulics, falling through the night in a dead aircraft. I managed to bail out at 8,000 feet. My radar operator wasn't so lucky. He was killed when the first shells hit. I never saw the American aircraft, not once. Just muzzle flashes in the darkness, then my aircraft was dying around me. In the parachute, I watched it burn on the ground below. I had survived 87 combat missions over 3 years. The Americans nearly killed me in 10 seconds. The psychological impact of P-61 operations extended beyond aircrew to affect German ground forces as well. Black Widows increasingly flew interdiction missions, attacking German transport convoys and trains at night. The distinctive sound of the R-2800 engines, a deep throbbing that could be heard from miles away, became a sound of terror for German soldiers. Unlike the high-pitched whine of single-engine fighters, the P-61's engine note was often described as sinister, a bass rumble that announced death approaching in darkness. German troops developed the same jabbo fever that had afflicted Luftwaffe pilots facing P-47s. The sound of approaching aircraft at night caused panic, sending entire convoys scattering off roads into ditches. This disruption was sometimes more effective than actual attacks. A convoy that took 6 hours to travel 50 miles due to repeated air raid alerts was nearly as damaged as one actually destroyed. Lieutenant Eugene Axtell of the 427th Night Fighter Squadron specialized in what he called train busting. Operating from bases in France, Axtell would patrol known rail routes at night, using his radar to detect locomotives by their heat signature. Once detected, a single pass with cannon fire was usually sufficient. The 20mm shells would puncture the boiler, causing catastrophic steam explosion that destroyed the locomotive and often several cars behind it. In November 1944, Axtell destroyed 11 locomotives in a single month. Each represented thousands of tons of supplies that never reached German frontline units. The cumulative effect of these interdiction missions was devastating. By early 1945, German military logistics had collapsed. Supplies existed in depots, but couldn't reach the troops who needed them. Trains moved only on the darkest nights, crawling along at reduced speed with minimal lighting. Road transport was nearly impossible. The German army, which had conquered most of Europe through speed and mobility, was reduced to static defense because movement meant death from above. The P-61's effectiveness in the ground attack role was somewhat accidental. The aircraft had been designed as a pure night fighter, but its heavy armament and stable gun platform characteristics made it superb for strafing and bombing. Some squadrons began carrying bombs routinely, typically 6 250-pound general-purpose bombs on wing racks. While the bomb load was modest compared to dedicated attack aircraft, the ability to deliver it with radar precision at night made the P-61 uniquely dangerous. German forces learned that darkness no longer provided safety. Camouflage and concealment, effective against daylight reconnaissance, were useless against radar. A tank hidden under trees might be invisible from above, but if its engine was warm, the P-61's radar could detect it. Supply dumps dispersed and camouflaged were located by the characteristic radar return of stacked materials. Even individual vehicles moving at night with headlights off could be detected and attacked. The Japanese faced similar problems in the Pacific, but with even less ability to respond. Japanese night fighters were virtually non-existent. A few units operated obsolete aircraft with primitive radar, but these posed no threat to P-61s. Japanese anti-aircraft defences, never as sophisticated as German systems, were nearly useless against fast-moving aircraft at night. The result was that P-61s over the Pacific operated with near impunity. Crews developed an almost casual approach to missions, knowing that detection and attack were unlikely. Lieutenant Robert Clyde, who flew 67 night missions over the Pacific, recalled that the greatest danger wasn't enemy action but weather and mechanical failure. We owned the night completely. The Japanese couldn't touch us. I flew missions where we orbited for hours over enemy airfields, waiting for something to shoot at. When Japanese aircraft tried to take off or land, we'd kill them. It was like shooting fish in a barrel. The real danger was thunderstorms and the distances. We operated over water, often hundreds of miles from base. If you had engine trouble, you were probably going to ditch. That scared us more than anything the Japanese could do. The distances in the Pacific theatre tested the P-61's endurance limits. Missions from Saipan to Iwo Jima covered over 600 miles, requiring careful fuel management. The P-61B variant, introduced in late 1944, included provisions for external fuel tanks that extended range to nearly 1,400 miles, making even longer missions possible. The P-61's stability and pilot workload characteristics made these extended missions feasible. Unlike high-performance day fighters that required constant attention, the Black Widow could be trimmed for hands-off flight. Pilots could relax somewhat during long cruise segments, conserving energy for the demanding task of radar intercept and combat. The autopilot, a rarity in fighters of the era, could maintain altitude and heading for extended periods. On ultra-long missions, pilots and radar operators would sometimes switch positions, allowing the pilot to rest while the radar operator, who had basic pilot training, maintained the aircraft in cruise flight. This was technically against regulations, but widely practiced and tacitly accepted by commanders who understood the physical demands of 6 or 7 hour missions. The crew coordination required for P-61 operations created bonds between pilots and radar operators that were unusual in fighter aviation. Unlike bomber crews who flew together for entire tours, fighter pilots typically flew alone. But P-61 crews were teams, dependent on each other for survival. Many pilots and radar operators flew together for their entire combat tour, developing an almost telepathic understanding. Captain James Bradford and his radar operator, Lieutenant Thomas Mason, flew 78 missions together without a single abort or failed intercept. They developed a communication shorthand so efficient that an intercept could be conducted with a dozen words or less. Contact, range closing, steady, fire, kill. Their efficiency was legendary in the 418th Night Fighter Squadron, with other crews studying their techniques. The human element of night fighting created situations of stark moral complexity. P-61 crews sometimes found themselves tracking obviously damaged enemy aircraft, bombers limping home on one engine, or fighters clearly in distress. The professional military approach was to attack regardless. A damaged enemy aircraft might be repaired and returned to combat. But some pilots struggled with what felt like execution. Lieutenant Walter Hughes tracked a crippled German bomber over France in January 1945. The aircraft was losing altitude slowly, clearly damaged, making no evasive maneuvers. Hughes closed to firing range and hesitated. His radar operator, sensing the pilot's uncertainty, said nothing. After 30 seconds, Hughes broke off the attack and let the German bomber continue. It crashed 15 miles later. There were no survivors. Hughes never knew if they died in the crash, or would have survived if captured. He never spoke about that mission, even decades later. Other pilots had no such reservations. The war had raged for years. Friends had died. The calculus was simple. Every enemy aircraft destroyed was one less threat to Allied forces. Lieutenant Robert Ferguson, the intruder specialist, destroyed 8 aircraft in night operations, including 4 transports clearly marked with Red Cross insignia indicating medical evacuation flights. When questioned about this after the war, Ferguson was blunt. They were legitimate military targets flying in a war zone. If Germany wanted to protect its medical flights, it should have surrendered earlier. I won't apologise for doing my job effectively. The moral ambiguity extended to ground attack missions. P-61s strafing convoys at night had no way to distinguish between military and civilian vehicles. In Germany's chaotic final months, military and civilian traffic often intermingled. Refugees fled westward on the same roads that military convoys used. Some P-61 crews undoubtedly killed civilians, mistaking refugee columns for military targets. The darkness that made the Black Widow so effective also obscured the nature of targets. A truck was a truck on radar, whether it carried soldiers or children. Some crews, aware of this possibility, restricted their attacks to confirmed military targets, locomotives, identified military convoys. Others took a broader view, attacking any vehicle movement in the combat zone. The official policy was that all transport in the combat zone was a legitimate target, but individual pilots made their own decisions. These decisions haunted some men for decades. As the war in Europe entered its final weeks, P-61 crews found themselves with decreasing numbers of aerial targets and increasing time spent on ground attack missions. Some units welcomed this shift, as ground attack was generally safer than hunting enemy night fighters. Others, who had joined to be fighter pilots, found the transition to ground attack unfulfilling. The final weeks also brought bizarre encounters. On April 27, 1945, Captain Theodore Hanks of the 422nd Night Fighter Squadron detected a large radar contact over northern Germany. Assuming it was a German transport or bomber, Hanks executed a textbook intercept. At 500 yards, he could see the target was a Junkers Ju 290, a large 4-engine transport typically used for long-range reconnaissance or VIP transport. Hanks opened fire, raking the large aircraft with cannon shells. The Jisu 290 immediately transmitted on the international emergency frequency, in English, requesting ceasefire. Hanks broke off the attack, confused. His radar operator contacted ground control, which confirmed the Ju 290 was carrying German officers attempting to reach Allied lines to negotiate surrender. Hanks had nearly killed a peace delegation. The incident was hushed up and the German officers completed their flights safely. After the war, Hanks learned one of the officers in the aircraft was a general carrying information about concentration camps, trying to reach Allied forces before evidence could be destroyed. Had Hanks pressed his attack, valuable intelligence might have been lost. The end came suddenly. On May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered. P-61 squadrons in Europe received stand-down orders. Within days, these sophisticated killing machines were flying training missions and patrol routes that would never again see combat. Some crews felt relief, others felt a strange sense of anticlimax after months of intense operations. In the Pacific, the war continued for 3 more months, but P-61 operations wound down significantly. With Japanese air power effectively destroyed, night interception missions became rare. The Black Widows increasingly flew reconnaissance and weather missions using their radar to map terrain and track storm systems. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, many P-61 crews were flying these unglamorous but necessary support missions. The post-war fate of the P-61 was swift and unceremonious. With the war over and jet fighters entering service, the Black Widow was obsolete almost overnight. Most P-61s were scrapped within months of war's end. A few served with Air National Guard units through the late 1940s, others were converted to F-15 reporter reconnaissance aircraft, operating into the early 1950s. But by 1954, the last P-61 was retired from military service. Of over 700 P-61s built, only 4 complete aircraft survive today. 2 are under restoration. One is displayed at the National Museum of the United States Air Force. One is at the National Air and Space Museum. These survivors represent an aircraft type that fundamentally changed aerial warfare but has been largely forgotten by history. The P-61's legacy is more conceptual than physical. It proved that sophisticated electronics could be integrated into combat aircraft to create capabilities impossible through human senses alone. The radar operator position evolved into the weapon systems officer in F-4 Phantoms and F-14 Tomcats. The emphasis on all-weather capability became standard for modern fighters. The concept of using information superiority to achieve tactical advantage became doctrine. The German pilots who survived encounters with P-61s carried memories that never faded. In post-war interviews and memoirs, veterans consistently described the psychological impact as worse than the physical danger. The terror of being hunted by an invisible enemy, the helplessness of being unable to fight back, the randomness of death appearing without warning from the darkness. These experiences haunted survivors for decades. Hans-Joachim Jabs, a German night fighter ace with 50 victories who survived the war, wrote in 1987, "We were hunters who became prey. For 3 years we had dominated the night sky, confident in our skills and equipment. Then, the Americans arrived with their Black Widows and suddenly we were helpless. I survived because I was lucky, not skilled. The Americans who killed my friends were skilled. They had better equipment, better training, better everything. We were fighting the previous war while they were fighting the next one." The technological gap that the P-61 represented was symptomatic of the broader industrial and scientific advantage that guaranteed Allied victory. Germany had excellent scientists and engineers, but operating under wartime constraints, resource shortages, and ideological interference. The United States had the luxury of time, resources, and a scientific establishment unhindered by political doctrine. The result was weapons like the P-61 that simply had no equivalent in the Axis arsenals. The cavity magnetron that powered the SCR-720 radar was itself a war-winning technology. Beyond its use in night fighters, it enabled improved naval radar that won the Battle of the Atlantic, ground mapping radar that allowed precision bombing through clouds, and proximity fuses that revolutionized anti-aircraft defense. The British invented it, but American industry produced it in quantities that made it ubiquitous. The same pattern repeated across technologies. The Norden bomb sight, originally a closely guarded secret, was eventually installed in thousands of bombers. The P-61's turbo-supercharged engines were derivatives of technology used in P-47s and B-29s. The 20mm cannon were licensed from British designs, but manufactured to tighter tolerances with better quality control. In each case, the ability to take advanced technology and mass-produce it with consistent quality was the key American advantage. German wonder weapons, jets and rockets and guided missiles were technologically impressive but strategically irrelevant because they couldn't be produced in sufficient quantities or operated effectively. The P-61 squadrons that patrolled the night skies over Europe and the Pacific were more than military units. They were demonstrations of American industrial and technological supremacy, proof that the United States could out-innovate, out-produce, and out-fight any adversary. The Black Widow's success was America's success, the victory of organized industrial capitalism over both Axis fascism and every other competing system. Today, the P-61 is remembered mainly by aviation enthusiasts and military historians. It lacks the iconic status of the P-51 Mustang or the glamour of the P-38 Lightning, but for German and Japanese aircrews who flew at night between 1944 and 1945, the Black Widow was the most terrifying aircraft in existence. The sound of R-2800 engines in the darkness meant death was hunting. The invisible enemy that killed without warning, that couldn't be fought or evaded, that represented the technological future destroying the tactical past. In the end, the P-61 achieved exactly what it was designed to do. It took the night away from the enemy and made it American. It completed the Allied domination of the air, extending that control into the final sanctuary of darkness. And it did this not through individual heroism or tactical brilliance, though there was plenty of both, but through superior technology, superior training, and superior industrial support. The same formula that won the war entire.